morning, everyone. This is Ryan from Ready Rhino 1. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about woodworking, which is kind of a semi-recent hobby that I picked up during the whole COVID-19 pandemic thing. I was kind of just sitting around the house and bored out of my mind, and not I had other stuff to do, but I mean, there's all these different gaps in the day that I just didn't really know what else to do with, and I didn't really have much of a hobby outside of playing video games and different things like that. So I decided that I should probably look into doing something else. Blacksmithing had always been something that sort of interests me, so I looked a little bit into that. I've watched videos before too. They're always kind of interesting. But looking into what you need to do in order to get into blacksmithing, it's like an anvil and different things. I guess you don't really need an anvil, but it's technically recommended that you get something kind of like that, some kind of workspace. You can only do so much, and anvils are just way too expensive. I mean, maybe the smaller ones are a little bit better, but I mean, they're not cheap. And there's a bunch of other stuff too, like a furnace, a gas-powered furnace in order to smelt different things down, buying crucibles and, forms and green sand and different things like that. And of course there's videos where you can kind of hack together something that's not as high quality, but can kind of get you by. And I don't know, like it just seemed like there was just a little bit more to it than I would necessarily like. But anyways, I'm sitting around the house and I'm kind of looking at other things, and I'm seeing that there's some different things around the house that need to be fixed. My front porch, the back deck. I wanted to put built-in bookshelves downstairs and pieces of furniture I'd like to acquire. And I started thinking like some of the furniture things I was wanting to get. They were not very complicated things to create myself, but they're still kind of expensive to purchase, even the lower to mid-quality ones. And I was like, well, I could probably make a low to mid-quality thing by myself and save a decent amount of money. So I started thinking, woodworking would be very much a very practical type thing. And I guess this kind of is more toward carpentry, not necessarily woodworking. But I mean, I just figured, I don't know. That's something that would be useful. I could do. I think I have somewhat of a knack for it. My uncle's pretty good at carpentry and different things like that. And my dad, he had built a couple of things when I was really young. So anyways, I kind of started kind of building up some tools for that. I had did a bunch of research, right? So I checked out some videos from Steve Ramsey, and he had kind of this like list of things that you can do to build up a workshop for under $1,000. Which again, like okay, if you're gonna spend $1,000 on woodworking tools, and then you're not gonna spend money on an anvil. But once if I were to do blacksmithing or metalworking, really, then I mean, it kind of narrows, like for what I was trying to do, it kind of narrows my options for practicality. There's not a lot of woodworking or not a lot of metalworking stuff that needs to be done around my house, but there is a lot of woodworking stuff that needs to be done around my house. So, I didn't really mind kind of investing in some tools for this kind of thing. So I picked up a table saw as my first tool. My dad let me have his circular saw and some two really cheap sawhorses that he had just kind of lying around. And so that was kind of my start. And it was fine. I mean, the table saw is a little bit daunting. I don't know if you've looked at any of the kind of the safety videos. I mean, I was interested in the safety videos. Looking at the manual, and the safety section of the manual was kind of a little intimidating. So I wondered, like, oh, this is probably a really, ugh, this is probably a really dangerous tool to have, and it is actually. But if you kind of take the time, do due diligence, you can get yourself up to speed and get through the necessary checks that you need to go through before doing some things. Really, the kickback is the biggest thing when it comes to table saw, and uh, particularly for a table saw, you tend to have what's called a rip fence that's attached to the table saw itself, and it's parallel to the blade, and it's so you can move a workpiece, alongside the rip fence in order to give it, just that even and squared uh, quality to the workpiece that you're trying to cut. And so the problem can come up that the the distance between the rip fence and the back of the saw blade can be less of a distance than the distance between the front of the saw blade and the rip fence, right? So you have a very slight trapezoid kind of shape in the center there, and this can be bad because as you're moving a workpiece through, it constricts towards the back, and so you have what's called binding. And also sometimes the wood piece that you're cutting, the wood fibers themselves are kind of under stress against each other. And when you cut some of them, then the stresses kind of cause one side or the other to then kind of slightly bow in. It doesn't really take much. The Since the blade is spinning kind of counterclockwise, the blade's teeth are kind of rotating toward you, so up and over and then towards you and then down. So what can happen is if it binds in the back, or the fibers kind of move a little bit of the workpiece in as it's being cut, those teeth can grab part of that workpiece and then basically pull the rest of the workpiece up and over its blade, kind of spinning it over the top of the blade, and it basically fires it back at you. This is called kickback. And because the blade is spinning so fast, you can get wood pieces that can, fire at you in excess of 100 miles an hour. I don't know if the wood piece itself is traveling at that speed, but the blade certainly is. So, I mean, because of inertia and all that kind of stuff, I mean, the wood piece it's going to move pretty fast, faster than you would want it to, right? I mean, I saw people who, really damaged themselves, ruptured organs in their abdomen, horrible, horrible bruises, and that's just with like the bigger, like the bigger pieces, but they're kind of lighter. Um, but if you're dealing with a large piece of a hardwood, I mean, some of that kind of stuff could probably go right through you, or just impale you in some way. It's not a good situation. So you just gotta be very careful when you deal with this kind of stuff. And the other problem is that if you're holding onto the workpiece and the blade causes it to climb up over it, it's going to drag your hand across the blade itself, and so people lose fingers this way as well. Um, so there's a couple of things that you want to do, using, you want to measure the distance between the blade and the rip fence on both the front and the back of the blade, to make sure that they're as close as possible to being the same. Um, those are some things you can do at the very beginning, before you even begin cutting. Typically, though, the blade's going to keep its square to the table pretty well, and it's going to stay aligned, but it doesn't hurt to double check. It only takes 10-15 seconds to do. Really, the biggest thing is the riving knife. It's a piece of metal that kind of sits behind the blade at the back, and a little bit over, in many cases, as you can adjust it. And this thing makes it so that when the piece moves through the blade, when it gets to the back, if it is binding, or if the fibers do cause it to kind of move inward, by that time, much of the workpiece will have moved beyond the riving knife, and so it will bind up or butt up against the riving knife and not the blade. And so that's what you really want. That's what eliminates a lot of the instances of kickback. And there's some other things too. I mean, you should be using what's called a push block. This is a chunk of wood kind of that's got some grooves on it that you can kind of place on the workpiece and move it through safely, so your hands aren't actually touching the workpiece as it's moving near the blade. Feather boards can be used on the other side that kind of make sure that there's like what's called horizontal or lateral pressure, making sure the workpiece stays flush against the rip fence as it's moving through. Obviously, you probably wouldn't use this. These are only for rip cuts. You wouldn't use this for cross cuts. For cross cuts, you would. These are kind of the smaller ones you would do. You make sure that the piece is kind of secured to the miter gauge as you slowly move it through. So again, and the miter gauge just moves it consistently on like a track that's usually built into the table. And so this ensures that the piece kind of moves through and that your hands aren't kind of near it. And you don't want to freehand it where you're holding both sides of a board and running it through this thing. You can really mess yourself up. So just a couple of different things there are some safety measures in place. I mean, there's also some blade guards and different things, and you also want to have hearing protection, eye protection, that kind of stuff. But it's pretty interesting. Anyways, I kind of went a little too far on the safety side of things, but I mean, I spent, I can't tell you how many hours I spent just watching video after video after video, some of which were kind of like horror stories, that kind of helped me to keep a little sober, a healthy amount of fear when approaching the tool, because really the table saw can be very dangerous. But if you take all the necessary precautions and you, like I said, you do your due diligence, things can go really well. And there's some other stuff too that kind of go beyond that. Like, are you feeling tired? Are you, distracted and that kind of thing? You want to eliminate all those. So you're just, you're trying to, even it may seem a little over the top, but I think it's worth it, not to put yourself in a position where you could be, potentially get yourself into a really bad safety situation, or lack of safety, that is. So you can imagine my horror when I first started using this thing, and because it comes the table saw comes mostly assembled. The riving knife was not in place, and so the first thing the manual says to do is like take that the plate off, or the blade plate off, and then you want to make sure, well, also that it's unplugged, and you want to pull the riving knife up and get it into position. And there's like this little turn latch that will secure it in place. Well, I didn't notice that on the riving knife itself, it had two like little pinhole type things that, so when you do, because it only has a couple of positions, and so when you get it into a certain position, there's two pinholes there, and they line up with two pins that are actually built into the blade housing itself. So the riving knife comes up to one of the positions, and when you lock it in place, it pushes the riving knife into place through those two pins, so it keeps it locked and steady in a very specific position. Well, I didn't really notice that the pins weren't lined up, and so I was kind of, not, I didn't try to force it, but I noticed that like the thing wasn't really in there too much, and so I started doing it, but it was still kind of lined up with the blade, so I didn't really think too much about it. Well, I did a couple of cross cuts, my first cross cuts, and they went fine, and then I was lining up for my next one, and as I'm going through because of the vibration of the table, the riving knife had come loose, and it just kind of fell down into the thing. I, freaked out. I kind of stopped. You can kind of hit the kill switch with your knee. The way the power switch is set up, you can kind of pull this thing up and it stays there, and then it's like a pad, so you can kind of hit it with an elbow or your knee or something like that. You don't really need a hand to actually stop it. So I hit the kill switch, right, and the whole thing powers down. I was like, I'm kind of hyperventilating. My heart rate's kind of up, and I realized that what I had done was really stupid. Now, fortunately, because it was a crosscut, the possibility of a kickback on a simple crosscut is pretty low anyway, and I had other precautions in place, so it probably wouldn't have been bad. But still, you just don't want to do it. So, in some ways, I'm thankful that the mistake I did make was one that had no consequences, at least that time, but it was enough to get me kind of like um, very keenly aware of what I'm doing for future references. So that was I'm kind of thankful for that little experience, but it was a little unnerving there at first, actually watching all these safety videos, taking all these precautions, and then I mess up on this one thing. So that was a little upsetting, but we move on, right? So once I kind of got into this a little more, I started, I had a lot of fun designing work pieces. So the very first thing I had to build was a workbench, right? I didn't really have a workbench. I just had this table saw. So the table saw itself is obviously this portable table. It's this one, and the table saw I have is a, contractor job site kind of one. It's pretty mobile. So I designed this workbench. I borrowed some ideas from other people's workbenches that they had made, and I wasn't trying to go for anything like really fancy where they have, all this stuff built into it, but I just needed like a shelf on the bottom, a decently sized tabletop with apron kind of overhang kind of thing, so I can clamp things to it. And then I also built this extension table off to the side, so that I could actually place the table saw on the extension, and the table saw's tabletop would line up flush with the rest of the table, so I had a bigger outfeed table that I could work with. So I designed all this thing, had a lot of fun measuring all this stuff. Finally got to use all that math that I learned in grade school, and so I started, building this thing out, and it went pretty well. There's little mistakes here and there and that kind of thing, and I also built a router table and then a modular table. The modular table so I could put like the drill press on, or I could switch it out and put the router tabletop on, things like that. So it was a lot of fun. The router table was probably the most complicated one. There's a lot going on, but it actually worked out pretty well. The router table fence, which is what you kind of butt the workpiece on as you move it through the router bit, and it had like a dust collection cavity and all this kind of stuff. And the it's not exactly square. It's pretty close, but not great. I'm probably, but that I can redo. But I have it on T-track, so it can secure pretty well. And I've got this plate insert that goes on. I'd laminate two pieces of plywood to make it really thick, and then route out an interior part so the plate would sit semi-flush. I didn't want to get too low, slightly up. So that all worked out pretty well. The only problem is it's kind of a really rough go at it. But I can always redo it. It's not the end of the world. The router plate itself is like a really hard polyurethane plastic. It can just unscrew and come out, and I can rebuild the whole thing and then drop it back into a new one, right? So that worked out, I think, decently well. I bought the router thinking that I had an earlier design for the workbench. I was going to actually laminate 2x4s vertically, not vertically, but they were standing up, the short side standing up, to make a really thick butcher block looking thing. It would have brought the price and the weight of the entire table up tremendously, which is pretty good because you don't want any kind of movement when you're working on something. But at the same time, it'd been a lot of work. I don't have a jointer that can process something like that. Something that size, you have to use what's called a router sled. I mean, I'm sure there's probably carpenters out there that would probably know exactly what an alternative is to that, but I saw you had to make a router sled that you just move the router across the table at a consistent depth, to basically make sure that everything, because there's like warps and stuff in the wood, bows and cups and well, the cups wouldn't matter so much, but the bends would, or these bows on the on the pieces itself, and so it would cause unevenness on the worktop. And so you have to use the router sled to move the router across it and to buzz down or chew down some of the higher parts of the wood. And then that's how you get an even and consistent thing. Then you have to run over it with a sander to kind of make sure it's really smooth. It is a lot of work. So I bought a router thinking I would do that. Well, now now I have a router table and I can just mount the router into that and use it for anything else. So yeah, I was wondering like I should do this really high quality one, but I was like, no, I just need something, right? So perfection is the enemy of the good, and I just needed something good, especially right now. It was my first time, so I didn't need to kind of go overboard with anything like that. So, anyways, I've made a couple of pieces since then. I made a patio table, a garden bench, and different things like that. I went through Steve Ramsey's kind of wood weekend woodworkers kind of thing. I forgot the name of it, but he kind of goes through a lot of the basics and introduces you to some pretty easy designs, and then you can make some practical things. And I'm in the middle of making the coffee table. Kind of got a little waylaid in this in this whole thing because just work stuff started coming up, and the pandemic stuff started becoming more relaxed, so it wasn't as bad. And so, just not nearly as much time. I'd love to get back into it. Of course, now lumber prices have gone through the roof. I think because I read that milling places have kind of eliminated some shifts, and so they're not producing as much. So there's a kind of a smaller supply, but the demand has remained the same, so prices go up. And so that's kind of unfortunate, but I'm sure things will even out in the coming months. So then I'll be able to get back into it. But that's a little bit about what I've gone through with woodworking. I think in future episodes I might talk a little bit about kind of some other projects I'm doing and maybe kind of get some pictures, video of that. I'm not really sure, but we'll see. But thanks for listening. Bye.